1879, a group of former slaves, called Exodusters, experienced segregation in the American South after Reconstruction. They were enticed to go to Kansas, and upon arriving, the Exodusters encountered challenges and successes on the prairie. They exchanged correspondence with family and friends in the South. Their stories of successes over these new challenges encouraged other groups of former slaves to move elsewhere as a small part of the Great Migration, where millions of African Americans moved north inspired to start a new life as the Exodusters had. After the Civil War ended, Reconstruction started so that the northern states could enforce the conditions under which the South rejoined the Union. During Reconstruction, Northern troops helped create a safer environment for former slaves and rebuild the southern states. African Americans worked to improve their conditions by trying to acquire their own land. With the promise that all former slaves would get 40 acres and a mule, they were able to live on their own land and work it. With the Compromise of 1877, Northern troops were removed from the South. Also, the land given to former slaves was taken away because plantation owners thought they had the right to take it back. This often resulted in putting African Americans on the plantations of their original owners, with no support from the North. The Southern states' governments set in place Jim Crow laws that discriminated against African Americans even though they were all now free from slavery. Many became sharecroppers, tenant farmers who worked for very low wages. Sharecroppers had to pay rent and buy food and supplies for themselves instead of having it supplied for them.
Oh, sharecroppers was bad for everyone because it's like now, what is it? I own my soul to the company store. Literally, you did, because sharecropping took you backwards into slavery.
Because of Jim Crow laws, African Americans still were not treated equally. With the creation of the Ku Klux Klan, a new era of violence arose. Some African Americans felt anchored in the South because they knew nothing other than it, but many decided to explore a life elsewhere. Benjamin Pap Singleton, an African American activist, businessman, and former slave, encouraged them to move to Kansas because of free land there due to the Homesteading Act of 1862. Anyone could move to Kansas and get 160 acres of land for free if they worked it for 5 years and were a citizen of the United States of America. Many former slaves wanted to leave the South, and the Homestead Act gave them an option where they could start anew. Singleton organized conventions so former slaves could discuss the idea of moving west. The idea of an all-black town was what encouraged large groups, like some churches, to consider moving. Some wanted to go to Liberia, but the majority of the former slaves decided to move west to the Kansas area. The former slaves, soon to be called Exodusters, started their journey to Kansas and the surrounding area in 1878. Like the Israelites in the book of Exodus, they explored a new land, only in this case, the dry, dusty American West. Real estate promoters, such as W.R. Hill, promised established towns like Nicodemus, Kansas. Some Exodusters took trains to Ellis, Kansas, and from there walked to their destination. Upon arriving, they realized that there weren't established towns like W.R. Hill had said, only open prairie. Many people stayed to make communities such as Nicodemus, but some people left their homestead claims, choosing to work in cities in eastern Kansas or continue on to California. The Exodusters that stayed became farmers on land that was very different from the southern soil, which was rich and fertile, but Kansas was dry.
It was a challenge for everyone, but especially for Exodusters who never had left the South before, and here they were free to move about the country. They didn't know where to go, or even so much where to go. And here they were out on their own, trying to survive on their own, some with help and some without, but it was because the biggest challenge was finding somewhere to go, and what do I do now that I'm free to move about the country. Mrs. Hickman, who when she arrived here, she left Kentucky where there was plenty of trees, moist soil, coming out to Kansas and finding there's nothing out here. They had been told that this was the land of milk and honey, plenty of trees, plenty of wild animals for farming and food, and coming out finding nothing here. That was a big disappointment for her and several other people, but with hard work and determination, they made the town work.
They encountered many challenges but also found ways to thrive with the help of their neighbors and the Kansas Freedmen's Relief Association, a group that helps support Exodusters that moved to Kansas. Weather was a challenge that was impossible to escape. Many Exodusters worked with neighboring settlements to learn skills that would help them survive on the prairie. They learned how to use fertilizer and make water irrigation channels. They worked with their neighbors, who were mainly white, but because they were all working under the same harsh conditions, their skin colors mattered less. Very few towns or settlements set in place laws that would discriminate against African Americans, and there were not many disagreements related to the color of their skin. A few Exodusters would move into nearby towns and work as apprentices or servants to make money for supplies their families needed. Towns were established, and during the process of creating them, many Exodusters wrote back to relatives or friends in the South telling them about their new life in Kansas. In these letters, Exodusters told about their experiences on the prairie and asked for more former slaves to come and join them in their settlements. As Exodusters exchanged correspondence with family and friends back home, other groups of relations decided that it may be a good idea to move away from the South. Letters from Exodusters living in Kansas stated that even though life on the prairie was harsh, it was better than living as slaves or sharecroppers. As more letters arrived from relations and friends, sharecroppers decided to move to places where they hoped that they could create better lives for themselves as the Exodusters had. Because of Jim Crow laws in the South, there was no opportunity for African Americans, and many wanted the chance for education but couldn't get it. Many former slaves overcame fears of leaving the only place they had ever known because it was the chance to live a free life. Not only did more former slaves move west, but they also moved north to cities like Chicago and New York City. This migration was the beginning of the Great Migration, which consisted of millions of African Americans moving out of the South to escape segregation and start anew. The population of African Americans in the southern states started to fall. The Exodusters didn't only encourage other African Americans to move out of the South, they also contributed to the economy in Kansas and the rest of the western states. Some Exodusters, or their descendants, decided to move off the prairie and into larger towns where many got jobs that required manual labor. Many African Americans took manufacturing jobs that boosted the economy in Kansas.
So when the former enslaved came to Kansas, they helped increase the number of people who was here, so therefore they purchased goods as well as help start towns to grow. So yes, they attribute to the economy in that way.
Also, with a large influx of people moving to Kansas, the populations of towns grew, and goods were purchased that weren't widely purchased before. More recently, the population of African Americans in cities have grown at a rapid pace as the relationships between them and people of other races has increased. Although all the towns but one, Nicodemus, Kansas, failed because of people moving into larger cities, descendants of Exodusters are still spreading their culture, such as song and music, and Southern roots in Kansas. Many have integrated into communities and around the United States. Every year, Nicodemus hosts a celebration called the Emancipation Celebration, where descendants of Exodusters gather together from around the country to share their histories. The descendants of Exodusters are now spread throughout the United States, living in many places other than the prairie. Only one surviving town, Nicodemus, has a small community of African American homesteaders still living there. When the first group of Exodusters came to Kansas in 1878 to explore new ways of living, they encountered many challenges on the prairie. Many exchanged letters with relations, inspiring other former slaves to move from the South to create communities of their own elsewhere. That migration impacted the economy and workforce of the West and spread African American culture throughout a new part of the country.
Read 'em, let me go. Now read 'em, John. Read 'em. Read 'em, John. Read 'em. Read 'em, John. Read 'em, let me go. Now read 'em, John. Read 'em. Read 'em, John. Read 'em.